Thayer Caldwell dismissed the board of directors with the same cool nod he used to close nine-figure acquisitions. But the moment the glass doors sighed shut behind them, the facade cracked. Sunlight slanted through the panoramic windows of Caldwell Innovations' 16th floor conference room, scattering off chrome fixtures and puddling in molten pools across the lacquered table. A warm October breeze, coaxed upward by the skyscraper's engineered updraft, set the miniature flags of the Boston Founders' Day Fair fluttering far below. Thayer caught himself staring, not at quarterly projections still glowing on the wall screen, not at the city's jagged skyline he usually read like a stock chart, but at the riot of color that had overtaken the plaza. Striped awnings snapped over booths selling kettle corn and candied pecans. A brass band sent ragtime ricocheting between the buildings. Children queued for a rocket-shaped ride whose silver fins flashed in the sun. Then, halfway through an indifferent sip of black coffee, he saw her. A little girl, 5, maybe 6, scrambled up the faux metal ladder into the rocket's cockpit, her ponytail swishing like a banner behind her. When she turned to wave at whoever waited below, sunlight ignited a tiny birthmark just above her right temple, a star-shaped fleck of russet on pale skin. The world narrowed to that single spark. Thayer's own matching mark, usually hidden beneath an impeccable fade, prickled as though someone had pressed a finger to it. The chair screeched backwards. Coffee sloshed onto an Hermes agenda, streaking the leather, but Thayer barely registered the stain. Numbers and responsibilities blurred. Something older, wilder surged up. A perfume of linseed oil and night-blooming jasmine. The taste of overripe figs devoured on a bridge of warm, worm-eaten stone. Florence, 6 years ago. A street artist named Bristol Hawthorne had dragged him laughing through rain-slick alleys to paint the Arno by moonlight, teasing that his expensive wristwatch was tick-tocking too loudly for the romance of the city. Dawn had found them tangled in a pensione room that smelled of turpentine and espresso, promising, or pretending, to meet again at the Uffizi. Instead, flight schedules and board votes had swallowed the moment whole. Thayer blinked. The memory dissolved, leaving the plaza returned to its bustle. The child was gone, swallowed by the ebb of festival-goers, but the afterimage of that star-shaped mark seared against his vision. Logic, a quality investors paid him well to inhabit, insisted on coincidence. Yet his pulse drummed a primitive counter-argument. Marks like that were rare and hereditary, said the pediatric dermatologist who had once tried to laser Thayer's away at his mother's insistence. The math he lived by whispered another statistic. 6 years almost precisely matched the girl's apparent age. Without conscious thought, he scooped up his phone, jacket, and car fob. The executive assistant, posted at the corner desk, managed a startled, "Mr. Caldwell, your 3:30 with Zurich," before the elevator doors closed on him. 30 seconds later, he was slicing through subterranean shadows of the parking garage toward his vintage Shelby GT350, a beast that usually emerged only for charity rallies. Today, the throttle served a different urgency. Tires shrieked against polished concrete, then bit into sunlight as the car vaulted onto Atlantic Avenue. He threaded traffic like a man born to chicanes, but 30 city blocks took an eternity when a single improbable possibility pulled harder than centrifugal force. Every red light felt personal, each taxi an affront. He found a spot 2 blocks from the plaza, doors slamming before the engine fully died. Vendors lifted curious brows as a man in a bespoke suit stormed past strings of balloon animals and displays of artisanal maple syrup. The rocket ride still spun, ejecting squealing children into the arms of waiting parents. Thayer scanned every cluster, searching for that glint of copper-brown hair, and, above it, the tiny constellation on skin. His breath came hotter than the Indian summer afternoon. At the caramel apple stand, he glimpsed a girl with a barrette shaped like Saturn. But when she turned, her temple was unblemished. Near the dunk tank, a freckled boy brandished a foam sword. For half a heartbeat, Thayer's vision invented the star before truth corrected him. The rational slice of his mind began a gentle autopsy. You are chasing a ghost, a genetic punctuation mark that means nothing. But when logic rubbed raw against longing, longing won. He paced the plaza in slow, widening spirals until the fair's music faded into dusk, and attendants folded up canopies. Finally, with shadows crawling over cobblestones, the realization settled like cold ash. If the child had been real, and every cell in his body insisted she was, he had no name, no face beyond the blur, no path to her, only a relic memory of linseed-scented laughter, and a scribbled name that might still be pressed between the pages of a long-forgotten travel sketchbook. A different man might have surrendered to coincidence and gone home. Thayer Caldwell returned to the Shelby, slid behind the wheel, and keyed the ignition into a low, meditative growl. The dashboard clock glowed 6:03 p.m., an hour he would usually dedicate to scanning Asian market futures. Instead, he pointed the car toward Beacon Hill, to the brownstone where memorabilia from dozens of rushed business trips lay boxed in a cedar-lined closet. Somewhere among boarding passes and complimentary city maps was a frayed moleskin, still smelling faintly of Tuscan rain. Its pages crowded with hurried sketches of domes and bridges, and, he prayed, the name and number of the woman whose star now burned on a child's skin. As the city lights streaked by, Thayer felt the tectonic plates of his carefully calibrated life begin to shift. Stocks could crash. Board members could revolt. Those were predictable storms he knew how to ride. But 6-year-old secrets wearing carousel smiles. That was uncharted ocean. And for the first time in years, the thought of venturing into the unknown did not scare him. It made him feel, incongruously, alive. Back in the Beacon Hill brownstone, Thayer prowled the quiet rooms, as if they belonged to someone else, flicking on sconces whose amber light spread like melted honey across mahogany floors, business trip detritus, Italian power adapters, duty-free receipts, a Mont Blanc pen still bearing a transatlantic scratch, filled the shelves of a walk-in closet he rarely entered. From the highest alcove, he pulled down 4 matching storage boxes, each labeled by a meticulous assistant who had never imagined their contents might matter beyond tax season. He settled cross-legged on the Persian rug and began excavating a fossil record of his own wanderings. Singapore boarding passes, Davos name badges, a red clay fragment from a Jordanian dig he had sponsored for the press coverage. Beneath a folded Armani sport coat lay the first box's real treasure, a navy moleskin whose elastic band sagged, puffed wide with ticket stubs and watercolor postcards. He opened it, and the scent of graphite and damp paper inhaled him back to Tuscany. Sketch after hurried sketch appeared. The ribbed cupola of Santa Maria del Fiore, a crooked rendering of the Ponte Vecchio in ochre and raw sienna, an unfinished profile of a woman laughing, her hair coiling around the page like ivy. On the inside back cover he found what he needed. Bristol's name in his own slanted script, followed by a phone number written quickly, the final digit corrected twice. No country code, no area code, just 7 integers, as if they could ring her studio from anywhere in the world. He tried anyway, thumb hovering over the keypad while a brittle hope tightened his chest, and heard only the stark syllables of an automated message. The number you are trying to reach is not in service. Once, twice, 3 times he dialed, changing the area code with each attempt. Florence, New York, Boston, Seattle, until logic reasserted itself. The trail, if any existed, was far colder than he had feared. At midnight, he accepted that improvisation had failed and opened an encrypted messaging app reserved for situations that demanded discretion. From the contact list, he chose Edeline Frost, a licensed investigator whose file read like blended folklore and resume footnote. A knack for cross-referencing city utility records against social media metadata. An ear for falsehood that made seasoned litigators squirm. And, most usefully, a reputation for never confusing data with gossip. They had met once when a Caldwell Innovations acquisition in San Jose required silent vetting of a founder's luggage-sized ego. Edeline had uncovered in 48 hours what 3 law firms could not in 3 weeks. Thayer composed a terse request. Need to locate Bristol Isolde Hawthorne, visual artist, Aproxis, 32. Last confirmed encounter Florence, November 6 years prior. Possible relocation to U.S. Northeast. Minimal paper trail. He attached a scan of the moleskin page and, almost as an afterthought, a cropped image of his own birthmark beside a note. Her child appears to have this. Before he could second-guess the vulnerability of sharing that. Intimate identifier, he pressed send. The reply came 8 minutes later despite the hour. Acknowledged. Estimate 36. Will revert. No need for pleasantries. Edeline billed in answers, not sentences. Thayer closed the laptop, lay back against the wall, and allowed the rug's embroidered constellations to spin until exhaustion finally eclipsed adrenaline. Yet sleep refused its usual numbing mercy. Instead, his mind replayed the midday vision over and over. Each loop sharpening details he could not possibly have seen. The way the girl's shoes, were they coral canvas sneakers? Kicked against the rockets. Metal hull. The way her laughter might have sounded had a pane of glass not muffled it. He drifted only when he promised himself that if Edeline failed, he would personally visit every elementary school in Greater Boston until a teacher recognized that star-shaped mark. Morning arrived with slate-gray clouds that threatened the late-season warmth of the day before. Thayer canceled his usual pre-market briefing, claiming a sinus migraine no assistant dared question, and fielded nominal status updates through earbuds while pacing the length of his kitchen island. At 10:17 a.m., his phone chimed. Edeline's secure line. Need video. She rarely wasted letters. A video call meant progress worth the risk of face-to-face. He accepted. Edeline appeared framed by rows of file boxes in what looked like a municipal archive, her silver-streaked hair pinned high with a carpenter's pencil. I traced Hawthorne through international customs declarations, she began without greeting. 2 shipments of art supplies from Livorno to the port of Boston 5 years ago, paid under the name Hawthorne & Glow, LLC. A flick of her stylus summoned a scan of bill of lading forms. LLC registration shows Bristol Isolde Hawthorne as majority shareholder, based out of Union Wharf, Boston. Single dependent listed in recent health insurance filings. Rowan Ellery Hawthorne. Date of birth, 9 July, 6 years ago next summer. Thayer exhaled a breath he had not noticed holding, seeing Rowan's name. Evidence that she existed beyond a split-second glimpse hit harder than the customs documents or the LLC. Yet skepticism, a habit as ingrained as breathing, whispered caution. Health insurance data can lag. We need confirmation she still lives there. Adeline angled her camera down to reveal a set of printed stills, street view captures, and a more recent frame from a local newsreel. A watercolor-splattered woman standing before an exposed brick gallery, a small girl by her side holding an oversized paintbrush. Even in the low resolution, the child's glimpse of a temple showed a blotch of darker skin shaped unmistakably like a 5-point star. News segment aired last month. Community feature on Inner Harbor artists, Adeline said. Gallery address matches the Union Wharf lease. I also pulled school enrollment. Rowan attends Harborview Elementary, grade 1. There is a father's name blank on every file. For a moment, Thayer's vision blurred. 6 years of strategic planning had never required him to consider fatherhood. Spreadsheets did not allow columns for lullabies or bedtime stories. But here was a line where his name might have been, a vacant placeholder in a public record that his absence had silently authored. He cleared his throat. Send me everything, and keep digging. I need contact protocols, how Bristol acquires materials, who signs for deliveries, any scheduled open studios. Adeline studied him. This is outside my usual corporate due diligence scope. We're approaching personal life territory. I understand the line, he said, modulating his voice so that it did not fracture. Stay on the professional side, but I will pay for the whole map. Her gaze softened a fraction. Then you should know one more thing. The birthmark, these nevus flammeus lesions, often inherit through the paternal chromosome. That's not proof, but it's a weighted coin. I know, he whispered, and ended the call before the tremor could betray him further. 2 hours later, a courier in a bright green vest arrived with an airtight envelope containing Adeline's preliminary dossier. Thayer read it standing up at his office window as rain began stippling the glass. Bristol's timeline emerged in crisp paragraphs. Scholarship to Rhode Island School of Design, year-long fellowship in Florence, abrupt return stateside after pregnancy, bootstrap opening of Hawthorne and Glow. One sentence leapt out. Frequently paints late at night. Neighbors complain of turpentine odor at 3 a.m., but Building Association waives penalties due to local arts grant. He could see her at midnight, sleeves stained cerulean, daughter asleep in an upstairs loft while city fog pooled over the harbor. The image filled him with an ache, equal parts tenderness and guilt. By sunset, Thayer had charted a plan with the efficiency of a turnaround bid. First, acquire a subset of Bristol's work through a blind art broker, a plausible overture that would put him in her orbit without revealing identity. Second, schedule a site visit to the gallery under the guise of philanthropic investment. Caldwell Innovations had a dormant Arts in STEM initiative he could resurrect overnight. Third, prepare for the possibility that Bristol wanted nothing to do with him, or worse, that she had long ago explained the star-shaped mark to Rowan with a story in which he played no heroic role. To fortify himself, he opened the envelope's final pocket. A candid shot Adeline had captured from municipal camera footage. Bristol kneeling to tie Rowan's sneakers outside a cafe. The mother's gaze was focused, joking, alive. The child's small fingers drummed impatient rhythms on Bristol's shoulder. They were a complete unit in that frame. no vacancy visible, no father required. Yet the star on Rowan's temple shimmered like an unanswered question, and Thayer knew questions were meant to be met, not avoided. He pressed the photograph against the window until city lights leaked through the paper, turning the birthmark into a tiny constellation, and made a silent vow that whatever lay ahead, anger, forgiveness, or indifference, he would not remain in absence, scripted by fear. He would cross the wharf's weather-worn planks and speak to Bristol Hawthorne not as a collector or a benefactor, but as a man who had finally decided a single night's promise should become a lifetime's truth. Fog drifted inland from Boston Harbor in slow billows that morning, muffling the horns of tugboats and carrying a faint, brackish tang up Union Wharf, where weather-gray pilings creaked like old violin strings. Thayer parked a conservative black sedan borrowed from Caldwell Innovations' fleet rather than risk the Shelby's too memorable roar, then walked the last block. Every sense strained for reconnaissance. He noted a bakery's cinnamon haze, a gull's ragged cry, the chatter of tourists debating lobster roll prices. Yet beneath those ordinary textures pulsed an electric undercurrent. He was about to step into the orbit of a woman who did not know he was coming, and of a child who might share his blood. A steel sign no broader than a sheet of copypaper marked the entrance. Hawthorne and Glow, the ampersand stylized as a paintbrush curling into flame. The gallery occupied the ground floor of a red brick warehouse converted into lofts, its street-side windows veiled with translucent rice paper screens that bled fragments of color onto the cobblestones. Thayer straightened the lapels of a charcoal cashmere coat designed to whisper affluent patron without shouting tech mogul. Then pressed the antique brass latch and felt it give with the softness of a well-oiled hinge. Inside, the world shifted from salt-damp harbor grit to deliberate hush. Track lights sliced through half-darkness, isolating canvases like actors caught in spotlights long after the play. The floors were original teak, buffed to an amber glow that mirrored every brushstroke above. Instead of the white cube sterility favored by most contemporary spaces, Bristol had chosen shadow and texture. Exposed beams carried the scent of pine tar. Rough plastered walls held flecks of what might be mica that caught stray beams and scattered them like distant nebulae. Somewhere deeper, a record spun lo-fi jazz on vinyl. The crackle between notes made the silence attentive rather than empty. A young attendant with a buzz cut and a nose ring looked up from cataloging pigments at a central drafting table. Thayer offered the practiced half-smile of a man used to granting benevolence. "I have a 10:30 with Ms. Hawthorne, Calder Bertram, representing the Helix Fund." Calder Bertram was a shell identity Edeline had registered through 3 holding companies less than 24 hours prior, a name that matched enough search engine detritus to feel legitimate, but nothing substantive enough to unravel back to him. The attendant consulted a digital calendar on a cracked iPad, eyes flicking between screen and visitor. Ms. Hawthorne just stepped upstairs to the studio loft. She asked me to escort you through the collection while she finishes a glaze coat. The voice held a subtle protective vibrato, as though any stranger might pose an existential threat to the art. Thayer nodded, allowing the prelude. Observation always served strategy. They began along the south wall, where a series titled Harbor Phantoms rendered dock workers and fishermen in sweeping strokes of indigo and ember, their forms melting into sea fog. The attendant explained Bristol's fascination with liminality, the threshold where a figure became mist, where certainty eroded under atmosphere. Thayer listened yet measured spacing between pieces, cataloged price tags, assessed foot traffic flow, all reflexes of a mind trained to convert beauty into capital. Still, he felt each canvas tug with something less transactional. Bristol's palette, once bright Mediterranean citrus, had matured into stormy chromatics with small detonations of light. He wondered if motherhood had introduced deeper chiaroscuro into her worldview. A wooden staircase, paint splattered along its risers, led to a mezzanine half concealed by suspended drop cloths. Voices floated down. A woman's low melodic cadence followed by a child's higher, insistent pitch. The attendant excused themselves to answer a delivery at the loading door, leaving Thayer alone at the foot of the stairs. Professional discretion dictated that he wait. Heart imperative urged assent. He chose a middle path. One step, then another, slow enough that tread squeaks announced him. At the top, he paused behind a canvas the size of a garage door, its reverse side haloed by solvent fumes. Through a tear in the drop cloth, he glimpsed Bristol Hawthorne exactly as nocturnal memory preserved her, yet tempered by seasons. Curls coaxed into a loose knot, cheeks speckled with ultramarine, posture relaxed in a paint-smeared boiler suit, cinched by a caramel-colored leather belt. She crouched beside a low work table where jars of pigment glowed like captured sunsets. Across from her sat Rowan on a high stool wearing denim overalls streaked chartreuse. Tiny legs swung as she concentrated on balancing two brushes across the rim of a rinse cup. The star-shaped mark on her temple appeared more striking in real daylight than in grainy footage, darker against the child's fair skin, a glyph no surname could erase. Bristol murmured encouragement. "Hold it level, my comet, or the handles will dive." Then glanced up as if pulled by unseen gravity. Her eyes locked on Thayer through the slit. For a heartbeat, neither adult moved. The jazz record crackled its instrumental interlude. A bead of sap-like varnish slid down the canvas edge and splashed on the drop cloth. Bristol straightened, wiping palms on her thighs, and in that motion Thayer saw twin impulses crash. The warm host prepared to greet a patron, and the startled guardian poised to shield her child. He stepped into full view, forcing his voice into steady neutrality. "Miss Hawthorne, apologies for the intrusion. Your attendant directed me this way." He extended a business card. Calder Bertram, embossed with the Helix Fund logo Edeline's design contractor had mocked up at dawn. "I believe you're expecting me." Bristol approached, but her eyes kept flicking to Rowan as though verifying safe distance. She accepted the card without reading it, fingers lingering on the weight of the paper stock as if assessing its truthfulness by texture. "Yes, Mr. Bertram, I'm applying final layers to a commission, but I can break." Her tone was courteous, yet the measured enunciation betrayed a mind already reverse-engineering him. Why did he climb unannounced? Why do his shoes track harbor gravel? Why does his gaze tether to my daughter between every blink? Rowan, oblivious to adult undercurrents, slid from her stool and crossed the floor with skipstone steps. She thrust a damp brush toward Thayer. "Want to see my whirlpool blue? Mama said I mixed it perfect." The child peered up, brown eyes flecked with bright sunbursts. Bristol's eyes, but the set of her brow, the angle of her cheekbones, those he recognized with a jolt as his own reflections from bathroom mirrors at painfully early conference morning hours. The brush quivered inches from his lapel. Thayer crouched, balancing expensive wool above potential streaks of cobalt. "It's a magnificent color," he answered, voice lowering to match hers, "strong enough to paint the deepest part of the sea." Rowan beamed, the kind of beam that unknots an adult's meticulously braided composure. Bristol's shoulders relaxed a fraction at the gentleness of the exchange, yet wariness persisted in the tight line of her mouth. She guided Rowan back to the stool, promising hot chocolate downstairs in 10 minutes, then gestured Thayer toward a corner alcove partitioned by easels. There, away from young ears, she folded her arms, not defensive exactly, more akin to a painter stepping back to critique composition. The Helix Fund's email implied interest in sponsoring my STEM through Art workshops, she said. "I hope you're not disappointed that the program is still more vision than infrastructure." Thayer had rehearsed this cover. He spoke of Caldwell Innovations' hypothetical grant initiative, never naming Caldwell, of course, and how Helix sought pilot partnerships that integrated kinetic sculpture with early science curricula. He sprinkled jargon about process-based discovery and cited 2 fabricated case studies in Portland and Denver. While his mouth recited these fictions, his mind interrogated micro-expressions. The slight hitch when she heard his voice timbre, the way her pupils dilated when he referenced Florence as the inspirational origin of arts in tech philosophy. She remembered then. He saw the truth ripple across her features like a brush stroke that pulls the entire painting into focus. Yet she neither named nor accused him. Instead, Bristol indicated a smaller canvas leaning face-in against the brick. "Before we negotiate grants, let me show you the piece I reserved for auction. It embodies the bridge between chaos and structure you described." She flipped the canvas outward, and the breath left him. The painting depicted a city skyline, Boston's rendered in abstract vector shapes, elongating into chords of color that morphed mid-air into a night sky over the Arno. 2 silhouettes stood on a bridge, one male, one female, arms raised as though hurling pigment into the cosmos. Overhead, a burst of starlight took the form of a single 5-point mark. The implication was unmistakable. Bristol had frozen their shared night in paint, then dragged it across continents into her present life. Thayer reached out but stopped short of touching the surface. "It's extraordinary," he managed, his throat constricted around questions too perilous to voice in a first encounter masquerading as business. The painting answered one of them anyway. Bristol had not forgotten, and she had chosen to remember through art rather than erasure. A whistle from downstairs interrupted, the attendant calling that a courier needed a signature. Bristol excused herself to handle the paperwork, granting Thayer a brief, unsupervised interval. He glanced toward Rowan. The girl balanced a marble on 2 brushes, concentrating with all the gravity of a laboratory physicist. Sun through a skylight haloed her curls. A parental instinct, foreign yet unmistakable, urged him to ensure she did not fall, did not dab pigment into her eye, did not feel alone even for a breath. He crossed halfway to her, then halted. Rights had not yet met responsibilities, and boundaries were sacred until truth found its voice. Bristol returned, cheeks flushed from the cold draft of the loading dock. She looked from Rowan to Thayer and back, reading atmospheric pressure like a seasoned sailor. "Mr. Bertram, would you care to schedule a formal meeting next week? I can prepare program outlines and budget projections." The words were professional modulations, yet a minor tremor vibrated beneath them. A violin string tuned just sharp of pitch. He inclined his head. "That would suit my board." He handed her a second card containing a private number routed through Edeline. Feel free to bypass intermediaries. Their fingers brushed. Static raced up his arm, memory colliding with immediacy. Bristol's eyes met his fully then, an unshielded moment acknowledging more than alias and pretense but not yet naming it. Rowan leaped down, announcing she had mastered her marble balance trick, and Bristol gathered the child into one arm. Paint smudged onto both their sleeves, an accidental badge of vibrant living. Thayer forced himself to back toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than bags packed for countless red-eye flights, because each step away fought the magnetic pull of revelation. At the threshold of the mezzanine, he turned once more. Mother and daughter stood silhouetted against stained glass light filtering through pigment jars, their twin star marks glinting like aligned planets. The sight etched itself onto whatever internal canvas recorded the most crucial moments of a life. Outside, rain had started in earnest, drumming on the wharf boards and turning harbor air metallic. Thayer lifted his collar, let cold droplets strike his face, and tasted brine. He had entered Hawthorne and Glow as Calder Bertram, potential benefactor. He departed burdened by a truth only partially disclosed. There could be no grant, no corporate mask thick enough to contain what pulsed beneath, yet he also recognized that storms must gather before they cleanse. Somewhere behind him, Bristol would be rinsing brushes, considering how a stranger sounded like a memory, how his eyes lingered too long on a certain constellation of skin. He had opened a door that could not be closed. Whether it led to reunion or reckoning would depend on the courage of their next words. Thayer returned to Union Wharf 2 nights later, under a sky the color of wet slate, having arranged by phone, this time under his real name, for a private viewing after closing. The harbor's whiff of diesel and kelp mingled with November's first true chill. Yet when Bristol unlocked the side door, she wore only a thin charcoal sweater already stippled with phthalo stains, as though she had stepped away from work for mere minutes, not prepared for a reckoning that might reshape every contour of her life. She led him wordlessly past the main exhibition floor. Lights dimmed to a dreamy twilight, and up the paint-splattered staircase to the loft. The record player was silent tonight. Instead, the hush held the dense resonance of a concert hall between movements, air thick with things about to be said. Rowan was absent. Bristol had arranged a sleepover with the neighbor's twins, so the mezzanine felt impossibly vast. Every brush and jar of pigment waiting in suspended animation for the collision of past and present. At the loft's far end, 3 large canvases stood like monoliths beneath translucent muslin, the fabric breathing in soft drafts from a roof vent. Bristol stopped beside them, fingers worrying the hem of the cloth, and looked at Thayer with an expression that mingled challenge, anticipation, and a fragile streak of fear. He noticed the freckles across her nose had deepened, sun-kissed from afternoons spent painting on the wharf dock. He noticed, too, that her left sleeve was rolled high enough to reveal a faint burn mark, as though she had brushed a heat lamp while reaching for something above her station. These details felt suddenly intimate, tokens of years he had forfeited. Clearing his throat, he asked if she was ready, though it was evident the question applied to far more than artwork. She inhaled, and gave the slightest nod before tugging the muslin aside in one sweeping gesture, like a stagehand revealing a set. The first painting captured Bristol herself, seated on a Florentine rooftop at dawn. Pale terracotta shingles arced under her feet, and sunrise washed the city in molten apricot. Yet the artist had rendered her own face not in serenity, but in reckless delight. eyes squinted against wind, mouth curved in a laugh that almost spilled beyond the frame. Curls leaping free of a bandana patterned with tiny constellations. The second canvas, equally large, depicted a child standing knee-deep in Atlantic surf, waves slapping her shins, brush poised like a conductor's baton. Behind her, gulls circled a sky cracked open by golds and violets, too vivid for realism. The drama focused instead on the star-shaped birthmark gleaming above her temple, stippled with flecks of iridescent copper leaf so it flashed even in faint light. The third painting rendered Thayer not as a likeness, but as archetype. A man in an overcoat striding between the Ponte Vecchio and Boston's Zakim Bridge. Entire cities flowing off the hem of his coat, the way wet paint runs down a tilted board. Most of his face dissolved into shifting prism facets. But on the visible temple, the same irrefutable star blazed, a beacon pulling two geographies, two timelines into confluence. Thayer stood motionless while the energy of the triptych poured through him in hot waves. He had acquired masterpieces, underwritten installations, toured private collections inside alpine bunkers. Yet no gallery floor had ever threatened the structural integrity of his knees the way this loft did now. Bristol, observing, folded her arms but stayed silent, forcing him to be first across the minefield of words. When he spoke, his voice cracked on the initial syllable. He steadied it by clasping his hands behind his back the way he did before hostile takeover speeches. He told her that these paintings were beautiful, but more than beautiful, they were evidence. Evidence she had remembered every shade of a night he himself had allowed to blur beneath deadlines and dividends. He admitted he had come under false pretenses because he had no vocabulary for what he had felt upon seeing Rowan on the carousel. How logic had dried up like an empty reservoir, and something primordial had swept in to claim its riverbed. Bristol kept her gaze fixed on the center painting, and when she answered, her tone was so low he had to lean closer to catch it. She recounted how, after discovering her pregnancy in Florence, she had left messages at the number he had given, only to reach an automated voice each time. She had envisioned dozens of futures, one in which he laughed with her child over homemade gelato, another where he dismissed them as inconvenient baggage. When none materialized, she resolved to build a life sturdy enough for two. She said she had not painted his face in that final canvas because she could not know how time would alter it, but she had never once doubted the shape of the star they shared. It was the fixed coordinate on every map she painted for Rowan, so the girl could always find her place in the cosmos. The confession broke whatever dam held Thayer's composure. He explained that the phone number in his notebook had lacked a country code, how he had called and believed the silence final, and how that painless error had multiplied into years. He spoke of boardrooms that felt echoing, despite their opulence, and hotel suites whose windows framed cities he did not bother naming, because no one awaited his descriptions. He acknowledged that none of these laments excused absence. When he finished, the room seemed to expand, the rafters arching away as if to give them additional sky for the next step. Bristol reached out then, not to him, but to the third painting, pressing her thumb against the birthmark. Pigment darkened fractionally beneath her touch. She said she had once considered mailing him a photograph of Rowan, but decided children should not be introductions in a letter like a corporate attachment. They deserved declarations spoken to their faces. She asked what declaration he planned. Thayer approached the second canvas and placed his palm over Rowan's painted heart. He said the only honest statement was that he wanted to learn how to be her father from this moment forward, and that he accepted any probationary period, any test, Any late-night call about fevers or math homework, or mounting a birdhouse improperly, if Bristol allowed it. Silence settled again. Different now, elastic and receptive. Rain began ticking the skylight. Somewhere below, the attendant locked the front door with a metallic clunk. Bristol exhaled, and it sounded like surrender. Not of strength, but of solitary vigilance. She reminded him there were practical matters. Rowan's routines, her affectionate allegiance to the neighbor's golden retriever, her habit of sleepwalking on nights before school field trips. Thayer answered that he would memorize these details as diligently as ticker symbols. She cautioned that Rowan might ask why he had stayed away, and that straight answers would be mandatory. He promised transparency scaled to a 6-year-old's comprehension, but never diluted by cowardice. She studied him a long minute, then flicked her gaze to the small burn on her arm, to the canvases, and finally to the man who had inspired them. With a painter's certainty, she nodded once as if deciding where the highlight belonged on a nearly finished portrait. Thayer did not step forward to embrace her. The moment required a gentler brush. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and produced the unsent postcard he had carried from Florence all these years. A quick watercolor he had made of the Ponte Vecchio under lantern light. Corners softened by time. He placed it on a stool beneath the triptych, an offering to the past that had stitched them back together. Bristol's lips curved, not quite a smile, more a pencil line marking a new horizon. She said they should let the varnish on the third canvas cure overnight. Then tomorrow they could carry all 3 downstairs for framing and plan how to explain to Rowan why her galaxy had suddenly grown a brand new sun. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming on the roof like applause, and for the first time, Thayer felt its rhythm not as a warning of delays, but as accompaniment to a scene finally, mercifully in motion. Edeline Frost arrived at the gallery the next afternoon in a trench coat still stippled with rain, a slim metallic case clutched like contraband under one arm, and her presence reset the careful equilibrium Bristol and Thayer had begun to sketch the night before. The loft smelled of drying varnish, unseen heaters clicking in the ductwork. Bristol had brewed coffee strong enough to tint the air with chicory, and Rowan, back from school, was sprawled on a canvas drop cloth sorting a constellation of plastic. Gears for a science fair contraption that would, she announced, spin all the planets at once, even Pluto, because Pluto has feelings. Thayer knelt beside her, sleeves rolled, genuine delight in his voice as he helped her match axle lengths. But when footsteps creaked on the staircase, he recognized Edeline's cadence before she emerged. He rose so quickly he snagged a paintbrush jar and nearly toppled it, steadying the rim with a palm before ultramarine could flood the floorboards. Rowan glanced up, tracking adult tension with the instincts of a child fluent in subtext. Yet she said nothing, only tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture eerily similar to Bristol's. Edeline greeted Bristol first. Professional nod, cordial smile, then turned to Thayer and flicked her eyes toward the case. He introduced her as Ms. Frost, a consultant, but Bristol's gaze sharpened on the container like a homing beacon. "Consultant for what?" she asked, wiping her hands on a rag. Edeline unlatched the case with surgical precision, revealing 2 swab kits, chain of custody stickers, and prepaid courier envelopes. Each item nestled in foam cutouts, a tableau of inference. "Genetic confirmation services," Edeline answered, letting the term hang in the varnish-scented air. The weight of scientific finality seemed to absorb even the whir of a floor vent. Rowan, sensing adult territory, crawled toward her gear pile, gathering planetary discs into her lap. Bristol crossed to the case but did not touch it, her jaw set at a fulcrum between offense and fatigue. She said she had imagined this moment in a dozen variations, some melodramatic, some clinical, none pleasant. What she had not imagined was her daughter assembling a model of the solar system while strangers discussed cheek swabs. She looked at Thayer and asked whether he believed numerical certainty outweighed the lived proof they had both witnessed in Rowan's smile, her birthmark, her impatience to understand how things worked, the very trait that seemed to run through Thayer's bones like conductive wire. Thayer answered that belief was no longer in question for him. He was convinced. The test, he admitted, was a relic of habit, the feel-safe protocol of a man whose world historically rewarded spreadsheets over stories. He could abandon it if the price of knowledge was Bristol's trust. Edeline, ever the pragmatist, reminded them that law and medicine favored documentation. Should Thayer wish legal guardianship, or should unforeseen health matters arise, a notarized result could shield Rowan from bureaucratic gaps. Bristol flinched at the word guardianship. So cold, so distant from bedtime rituals and scraped-knee consolations. And, said, guardianship was not a share. It was a heartbeat cadence learned over nights of fever and dreams. Thayer crossed the room, stopping short of the radius that would constitute pressure, and spoke quietly. He said he would sign any document Bristol drafted, granting her sole authority until Rowan turned 18 if that was what safety required. The swabs would never leave the case unless she desired them out of it. The only irrevocable action he intended that day was to keep building the planetary gear set, because a science fair deadline loomed larger in a 6-year-old's universe than adult abstractions. Rowan, hearing her domain mentioned, called out that she needed a flathead screwdriver, the small one that looked like a needle. Bristol retrieved the toolkit and handed it silently to Thayer, her fingers cool when they brushed his. He knelt again, and together he and Rowan aligned the brass sun at the apparatus's center, snapping Saturn's rings into place with satisfying clicks. Bristol watched, the ease of Rowan's grin, Thayer's patience coaxing a stripped screw, the way both foreheads knitted in identical angles when a gear refused to seat. Something in her chest, rigid for so long it had calcified, softened like pigment warming under a light bulb. When the model was finally upright, delicate arms poised to rotate, Rowan insisted they christen it. "Every ship has a name," she declared. Thayer suggested Galileo, but Rowan frowned. Too obvious. Bristol proposed Starling, citing the murmuration patterns she'd been teaching her daughter. But Rowan decided that sounded like a bird getting confused with galaxies. After a minute, the girl's eyes lit. "Aurora Caldwell Hawthorne," she said, pronouncing each word as if pinning it on a prize ribbon. Bristol's breath caught. She glanced at Thayer, braced for disagreement over surnames, yet he only smiled. A brief, unguarded curve that erased 2 decades of polished stoicism. He said the name combined dawn and family. He could imagine no finer christening. Rowan, satisfied, twisted the starter crank, and the miniature solar system whirred alive. Planets gliding in concentric orbits, the brass sun casting flecks of reflected light up the loft walls like cosmic confetti. Edeline closed the metallic case without fanfare, slipped it under her arm, and murmured that she would return when needed. Her boots tapped down the stairs, echo fading into the gallery's darkened shell. Bristol crossed to the window where dusk leaked purple over the harbor, and asked Thayer, almost absently, whether he ever felt data could fail to quantify wonder. He answered that data had won him empires, but had never filled the silence of hotel rooms. Wonder, he suspected, might. She turned then, leaned against the casement, and the last light outlined her profile. The same strong arc he had sketched in Florence, now tempered by 6 years of motherhood's undocumented miracles. She said she would think about the test, not for herself, but for Rowan's future medical charts. And Thayer accepted the provisional maybe with gratitude that felt shockingly like triumph. Rowan, arms wrapped around her knees, watched the orrery spin until gears wound down, then asked if tomorrow they could paint the model so each planet glowed in the dark. Bristol promised yes. Thayer added they would need phosphorescent pigment and a protected workspace. He could bring drop cloths from his office maintenance stash. Rowan clapped approval, and Bristol's eyes, lifting to meet his, carried a shimmer equal parts amusement and astonishment. That a corporate titan would raid supply closets for glow paint and tarp. Night deepened, coaxing the harbor into obsidian stillness. Thayer buttoned his coat, hesitated, and finally extended a small spare gear between finger and thumb. For replacement, he told Rowan, in case one ever wears out. She pocketed it solemnly as though entrusted with rare stardust. Bristol walked them to the stairwell, stopping on the landing where a string of fairy lights cast gentle halos. She touched Thayer's elbow, a gesture so light it could have been accidental, and said, "Thank you for not forcing certainty." He replied that the only certainty he wanted was Rowan knowing the planets would keep turning, and if he could help wind the crank, it would be privilege enough. Bristol's lips curved into a genuine smile then, and for the first time since their reunion, Thayer sensed an open door instead of a guarded threshold. He stepped out into the crisp air, lungs filling with salt and possibility, and, as he headed toward the sedan, he realized the DNA kit, Fortress of Answers, remained unopened behind a locked gallery door. A month ago, that omission would have gnawed at him like missed earnings guidance. But beneath Union Wharf's sodium lamps, with the sound of invisible gears still humming in his ears, the absence of data felt less like risk and more like trust in motion. An algorithm he could finally allow to run without debugging every line. A week. Later, winter clung to Boston with glassy claws, the harbor sealed in a brittle sheen that amplified every distant foghorn into a cathedral organ. Bristol stayed at the gallery after hours to finish priming a commission bound for a Tokyo tech campus, her breath visible each time she stepped into the drafty loading bay to shake the spare turpentine rags. The building's 19th-century wiring, temperamental on ordinary evenings, had turned petulant under the strain of space heaters and halogen lamps. But she coaxed it along with the confidence of someone who'd replaced more fuses than canvases. Around 9 o'clock, the first flakes began skittering across the skylight, and the radio forecast upgraded the storm from advisory to outright warning. Yet Bristol declined the attendant's offer to stay. Rowan was camped 2 blocks away at Mrs. Palfrey's apartment, watching stop-motion holiday films and downing marshmallow cocoa. Bristol calculated she had 2 uninterrupted hours before mother guilt would kick in. Plenty to lay the final gesso and sand the underlayer smooth. Down Commonwealth Avenue, Thayer finished a late dinner with a Japanese venture delegation. Contractual pleasantries delivered, truces toasted with plum sake, and checked his phone out of habit. A quiet notification from the gallery's newly installed smart sensor system pinged. Temperature spike in loft quadrant B. He frowned, thinking perhaps Bristol had simply cranked the radiator, and tapped Adeline's monitoring app to dismiss the alert. 20 seconds later, another ping, this time accompanied by a carbon particulate flag. The metrics jumped so sharply the graph resembled a seismograph. Thayer excused himself from the table, heart accelerating past boardroom decorum, and dialed Bristol. The call went unanswered. He paid the check by thrusting a black titanium card at the bewildered maître d'œuvre, and sprinted through sleet to the waiting sedan, instructing the driver to break every traffic law between Back Bay and Union Wharf. Inside the loft, Bristol stood on a ladder feathering primer across the canvas's top corner when the overhead work lamp flickered. She muttered a curse in Italian learned during her fellowship years and reached for the outlet. Just as a blue spark leapt from the power strip, ran the extension cord like a fuse, and vanished behind a supply shelf. A second later, the unmistakable scent of burning plastic threaded the air. Bristol descended, rubber soles sticking to rungs as static crackled around her. At the base of the shelf, tiny orange tongues licked a coil of painter's rags soaked in linseed. She grabbed the ABC extinguisher, tugged the pin free, but before she could aim, flame darted up the wall, igniting a vertical artery of centuries-old pine. Panic hammered at her ribs, yet she forced herself into deliberate motion, remembering the evacuation drill she and Rowan had rehearsed after a similar scare in a friend's pottery studio. She cut the main breaker, yelled fire into the stairwell, though the building seemed deserted, and sprinted for her phone, left on the mezzanine railing, only to watch impotently as a second flare erupted directly beneath it, melting the case into unrecognizable slag. By the time Thayer's sedan fish-tailed onto Atlantic Avenue, the gallery's southern windows pulsed a violent orange behind curtains of snow. The driver started to radio for firefighters, but Thayer was already running, coat flapping like a broken sail. He caught the brass handle of the side door. Heat bit his palm through leather gloves, yet the latch mercifully clicked. Inside, a backdraft of smoke rushed him, thick as tar, and salted with the chemical sting of burning solvents. Dropping low, he crawled, counting memories like lifelines. Rowan's grin, Bristol's varnish sweet laughter, the star marks. He shouted her name, voice shredded by coughs, and for a moment heard nothing but the roar of flames devouring canvas. Then, from above, faint but distinct, came 2 syllables. Here. Bristol clung to the mezzanine banister, face streaked with soot, one sleeve scorched where she'd tried beating at flare-ups. She'd attempted to smother the fire with wet drop cloths, but the old wiring had burst into a crown of sparks overhead, blocking the stairwell with a sheet of flame. Thayer took the steps 3 at a time, though heat blistered the varnish beneath his shoes. At the landing, he shrugged out of his wool overcoat, wrapped it around her shoulders, and guided her back toward the stairs, even as rafters snapped with gunshot cracks. Halfway down, a timber above groaned and pitched. Thayer yanked Bristol sideways, tumbling both of them against the gallery wall, while the beam thundered onto the steps in a hail of embers. Their exit sealed, he scanned for alternatives and spotted the freight elevator on the far side, its iron cage likely fire-rated from the warehouse era. They ran, weaving between smoldering frames, guided by the strobing flicker of emergency exit lights until they reached the lift. Thayer hammered the down button, praying circuitry from 1890 proved sturdier than cables from 1980. Miraculously, the gate shuddered open. They ducked inside, metal ribs searing fingers as he slammed the gate shut. As the cab descended, Bristol sagged, adrenaline giving way to tremors. She tried to speak, but coughed instead, lungs saturated with smoke. Thayer stripped the coat, pressed the cleanest edge against her mouth, and wrapped an arm around her when the elevator jolted to a stop at ground level. The doors parted to reveal icy night swirling into the loading bay. Snow hissed upon entering, steam rising where flakes met warped floorboards still glowing red beneath char. They lurched outside into the alley, sucking air that tasted impossibly clean. In the distance, fire engine sirens wailed, their neon pulses reflecting off harbor ice like a broken aurora. Bristol turned to watch her life's work. A decade of canvases, sketches, dream-scrawled journals burn behind grimy panes. Tears carved rivulets through the soot on her cheeks, but her hands stayed at her sides, fingers curled tight as if afraid grief might scatter them. When firefighters arrived, they found the flames already chewing through the roof. Containment, not rescue, became the objective. Thayer insisted paramedics treat Bristol first, ignoring their urging that he have his blistered hand iced. Only when an EMT began bandaging her forearm did Bristol seem to register him. She caught his wrist, squeezed, and whispered that Rowan was safe with Mrs. Palfrey. Information he didn't know he'd been holding his breath to hear. An engine captain asked for building schematics. Bristol recited the layout from memory, voice rasping but steady, pausing only when smoke cracked her throat raw. Thayer offered structural details he'd learned from renovation invoices he'd covertly paid months earlier, astonishing her into a sideways glance. Hours later, the gallery a skeletal frame smoldering under floodlights. Bristol sat in the back of an ambulance swaddled in a wool blanket, while Thayer, arm in a sling of burn cream and gauze, leaned against the open doors. Snow had ceased, leaving crunching drifts that mirrored ash heaps. She said she felt hollow, as if someone had scooped the pigments out of her veins. He answered that hollow spaces could be galleries too, engineered to house new constellations. She shook her head at the overt metaphor, but a faint smile twitched despite exhaustion. He promised to rebuild, not as charity, but as collaboration. Glass walls curved like sails to funnel light, solar arrays hidden on the roof, sprinkler systems so advanced each nozzle read temperature in real time. Bristol's eyes glazed, a blend of disbelief and dawning possibility, and she confessed she did not know if she could paint same again after watching colors melt into toxic smoke. Thayer countered that phoenix feathers glowed brighter because they remembered fire. Perhaps the next paintings would hold spectra no primer had ever dared contain. At dawn, when the last ember flickered out, he hailed a car and rode with her to Mrs. Palfrey's. Rowan slept on a pull-out sofa under an avalanche of cartoon quilts, 1 foot hanging, star mark visible even in shadow. Bristol hesitated by the doorway, sudden tears threatening to restart the flood. Thayer ushered her inside, pausing only long enough to tuck a charred, half-melted gear from the orrery, a relic he'd found on the loading bay floor, into his pocket. Tomorrow, he vowed silently, they would assemble new gears, draft new blueprints, and fuse tragedy to ambition until it formed something stronger than either. For now he settled on the threshold, content to watch mother and daughter breathing in synchrony, each inhale proof that amid flame and ice the heart lines connecting them had not been severed, but forged in a hotter kiln. By the middle of April, 5 months after the fire, Union Wharf smelled less of char and wet ash, and more of freshly cut cedar and new plaster, the alchemy of rebuilding having turned the blackened skeleton into the crystalline shell of Constellation Gallery. From the street, the facade looked like a single curved sail caught mid-tack, its panels of dichroic glass shifting hue with every cloud that crossed the harbor. Jade at sunrise, amethyst by noon, indigo once dusk slipped in. Thayer had pulled 3 teams of architects off corporate data campuses and told them to listen to Bristol first and spreadsheets second. The result was a structure whose lines tracked the vectors of her broad brushstrokes. Inside, daylight pooled along a polished concrete spine that sloped gently upward, guiding visitors the way wet paint guides the eye. Overhead, programmable LEDs mapped the night sky exactly as it had appeared above Florence on the November evening, 6 years earlier, when 2 near strangers had mixed vermilion on a bridge parapet. The stars brightened and dimmed in real time as astronomic software read live ephemerides, so that stepping through the gallery felt like walking inside an enormous astrolabe. The opening night arrived on a gold-washed spring evening, so mild the harbor's surface lay unruffled, reflecting the gallery until it seemed as though 2 identical buildings, one standing, one submerged, formed an hourglass, holding the city between them. Thayer, for once without the camouflage of a boardroom suit, but in a collarless midnight blue jacket Bristol had chosen, circulated through clusters of donors and city hall officials, his customary acquisition smile replaced by something both softer and more luminous. He had learned, in the months of Reconstruction, to translate balance sheet language into community grants, to trade non-disclosure agreements for workshop syllabi. And he moved with the unhurried confidence of a man whose greatest investment was measured not in percentages, but in square footage of sunlight. Whenever he paused to greet someone, the cuff of his sleeve revealed a faint scar on the forearm, remnant of a falling ember, and a surprising number of guests who had read the pre-opening press features noticed, nodding silent respect for a patron who had literally carried canvases through fire. Bristol spent the early part of the evening backstage in a glass-walled studio that jutted like a lantern above the main exhibition floor, adjusting the hanging height of the triptych she and Thayer had first unveiled in the loft. Her rooftop, self-portrait, Rowan in the Atlantic surf, the faceted silhouette of Thayer bridging continents. Months earlier, the 3 canvases had seemed residue of grief. Now, against the prismatic glass, they felt like foundation stones. She checked the tiny copper-leaf stars one last time, ensuring the gallery lights struck them at the precise angle to ignite a flicker visible even from the entrance. Then she breathed once, steadied her shoulders, and descended the ramp to join the gathering. Rowan, who had insisted on designing her own outfit. Indigo twill dress, glow-in-the-dark constellations splattered across the hem, silver sneakers that blinked with each step, darted among crowds distributing hand-drawn maps of the new gallery. At the center of every map she had placed a swirling gear symbol titled Aurora Caldwell Hawthorne Orrery Workshop, scheduled every Saturday morning in Studio B. When guests asked for details, she explained with gravitas beyond 6 years that the workshop would teach planetary ratios through paint and sprockets. She had hired her parents as assistants because they need practice sharing orbits. Laughter followed her like a meteor tail. At 7 precisely, house lights dimmed, and the overhead LED starfield brightened to full intensity. The murmuring stilled, replaced by a collective intake of breath, as the software adjusted the projection to align the stars over Boston with those of Florence, merging 2 skies into a single luminous lattice. Thayer stepped onto a small stage flanked by the triptych and waited until silence settled deep enough to hear the harbor slap pilings. He spoke not with the clipped cadence of investor calls, but in a low, measured timbre, he had practiced only once, reading Rowan a chapter of From the Mixed-Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler by flashlight during a night of a snow-blown power outage. He told the crowd that cities were not defined by skylines, but by the bridges that joined their separate shores. Bridges of steel, of art, of improbable second chances, and that tonight every person in the room constituted an arch in the newest span. He acknowledged the fire without euphemism, naming the loss as catalyst, not tragedy. He thanked the firefighters who stood along the back wall, hats in hand, and the local carpenters who had taught him to sand cedar planks until his palms hummed. When he introduced Bristol, calling her the cartographer of starlight, applause swelled so loud the glass panels reverberated like tuned drums. Bristol faced the audience, cheeks flushed above soot ghost scars that only she noticed in mirrors now, and spoke of pigment. She described how certain dyes, when heated beyond their flashpoint, disintegrated into transparent ash that later hardened into stronger crystalline matrices. Exactly what had happened inside every one of them. She thanked the children from Harborview Elementary who had donated marbleized paper marbles, now embedded under the entryway resin floor like a river of planets. And she thanked Thayer for insisting the new sprinkler system include foam cannons. The size of small cannons. Laughter rippled. But when she turned toward him, light catching the copper flecks in her eyes, the moment stilled into a hush more intimate than any side conversation. The ceremony concluded not with a ribbon cut, but with a dimming of the interior lights, until only the LED starfield glowed. As the room darkened, the glass facade's dichroic panels responded, turning the entire building into a lantern of shifting nebulae. A low motor whirred, and from the ceiling, a kinetic sculpture descended. Rowan's rebuilt orrery, now 8 feet across, planets forged of brushed aluminum, rings laced with fiber optics. The sun at the center had been replaced by a hollow crystal sphere containing curled fragments of charred pine and a single gear recovered from the fire. When the structure locked into place, Rowan stepped forward with a handheld console, pressed a green button, and the mechanism spun. Galaxies of refracted light danced around the atrium. Gasps echoed, followed by applause that felt like surf pounding a seawall. Afterward, guests wandered through galleries named not by numbers, but constellations. Orion Hall, Cassiopeia Alcove, sampling hors d'oeuvres and interactive digital installations that let patrons paint auroras across a curved LED canvas with the sweep of a palm. In Andromeda Nuke, a VR headset transported wearers to a simulation of the night Bristol and Thayer met. AI reconstructing the Arno's moonlit ripples using archived weather data. Each edition could have felt gimmicky, but didn't. The technology served the art the way frames serve paintings, invisible except where it lifted color closer to breath. Near 10 o'clock, as the crowd thinned to die-hard art critics and friends reluctant to surrender the glow, Thayer found Bristol leaning on a balcony rail above the atrium, watching Rowan thread through adults like a comet finding trajectories. He stepped beside her, their shoulders almost but not quite touching, and exhaled a slow breath of cedar and night air. She asked whether he thought the gears would hold. They were still testing torque ratios on Jupiter's orbit. He answered that even if they stripped again, they had enough spare parts to rebuild 1,000 times. Resilience was now a line item in the annual budget. She laughed, soft, the laugh he remembered from a bridge, and said she had never imagined a lover who tracked gear inventory as love language. He replied that love could be a ledger, so long as both sides balanced wonder against fear. Below, Rowan stopped at the base of the ramp, lifted her arms, and spun until her dress's constellations blurred into one dizzying aurora. "Mom! Dad! It works!" she shouted, voice echoing. Bristol gripped the rail, surprise bright in her eyes that the child had spoken the new word so freely. But there was no time to weep because Rowan was already sprinting up the incline. She collided into Bristol's embrace, then reached to tug Thayer's sleeve, insisting they join her for a 3-person waltz beneath the giant clockwork heavens. Thayer, ignoring the stiffness of a half-healed graft on his hand, twirled her while Bristol kept time, and for a minute the three of them orbited an invisible axis, laughter rising higher than the metal planets. Later, after the last critic closed a notebook and the catering crew wheeled out empty platters, Thayer locked the glass doors, leaving only emergency lights and the soft pulse of the star ceiling. He and Bristol walked hand in hand along the gallery's central spine, while Rowan, sleepy now, rode on Thayer's shoulders. They paused before the triptych, light low enough that the copper stars glimmered like distant fire ships. Bristol traced the arc of paint that connected the rooftop portrait to the sea painting, and said every story left a seam, sometimes clean, sometimes jagged. The burning had welded theirs too visibly to hide, so they might as well gild the join. Thayer replied that in Japanese kintsugi, artisans repaired shattered ceramics with gold to show breaks as beauty. Perhaps Constellation Gallery was their kintsugi. Rowan tugged his hair, asking if kintsugi was also the name of the new cat they had promised once construction noise ended. Bristol said the kitten would need a shorter name to understand commands, but they could call him Kintsu for short. Thayer agreed, adding that Kintsu could become unofficial night manager, patrolling stars for orbit drift. Rowan approved this governance structure with a decisive nod, head tipping against his. They reached the building's glass threshold and stared out. The harbor lay ink black, pricked with anchor lights. Over downtown, the real sky mirrored the digital one, constellations exactly where the algorithm predicted, yet somehow infinitely more. Miraculous. Bristol unlocked the service door to let the night breeze swirl through the atrium, carrying brine and the faint, bright smell of river ice still breaking upstream. She whispered that the world had never looked so wide. Thayer answered that maybe it had always been this wide. They had only needed to survive a crucible hot enough to melt the blinders. Rowan, eyelids drooping, murmured that tomorrow they should paint the moon on the glass so people who forgot to look up would still see it. Bristol promised they would. Thayer whispered they would have enough paint, enough glass, enough hours. And with that certitude, no certificate, no genetic proof, only the living constellation of 3 shadows moving together, they stepped into the April dark, leaving the gallery glowing behind them like a lighthouse whose beacon pointed both outward to seafarers and inward to the passages of the heart. Morning sunlight, the color of poured honey, flooded the loft apartment above the new Constellation Gallery, coaxing Rowan awake earlier than usual, and revealing, on the kitchen island, a roll of craft, paper almost as tall as she was. Bristol had set out charcoal pencils and a jar of glitter beside it the night before. But until the first golden rays caught the mica flecks in the glitter, Rowan hadn't understood the surprise. Now she did. Today was Family Heritage Day at Harborview Elementary, and instead of carding in a flimsy prefab poster, Bristol wanted her daughter to walk through the classroom door with an unfurling mural, a living map bigger than any trifold. When Thayer padded in, bare feet, coffee steam haloing his head, He found mother and daughter already elbow-deep in charcoal dust. He kissed Bristol's temple, left a smudge of soot on her skin, and accepted the pencil Rowan passed him like a relay baton. The assignment sheet Bristol had pinned to the wall instructed students to trace their lineage back at least 2 generations. But Rowan insisted 2 was unimaginative. She wanted to chase the Caldwell line across Pennsylvania farmland and Hawthorne painters back to a chalk quarry in Devon, and farther still, to the unnamed ancestors who, her textbook said, once hunted mammoths on land where the harbor now roiled. With sailboats, Bristol laughed at the grandiosity, but Thayer told his daughter every map worth hanging began with audacity. The rest was diligence and time. They started in the mural's center with a life-size charcoal sketch of Rowan herself, curls alive with Bristol's quick strokes, star-shaped birthmark smoothed in with a dab of glitter glue. From that figure radiated thick vines of lineage, names inked in alternating cursive scripts so the Caldwell branch looked like disciplined ledger entries, while the Hawthorne branch sagged with flamboyant serifs. Halfway through, Rowan asked where to place the star gear salvaged from the burned orrery. Bristol suggested gluing it at the nexus where the 2 branches intersected, because both sides, molten and reforged, belonged equally to her. Thayer produced a small tube of 2-part epoxy, and together they fixed the warped brass gear so it sat like the heart of a compass rose. The clock ticked menacingly toward school bell, and Rowan urged speed, reminding them her teacher deducted points for tardiness even from students showcasing intergenerational art projects. Traffic along Atlantic Avenue conspired to delay them, but Thayer's new half-serious rule that the gallery SUV was strictly forbidden to exceed the speed limit when transporting precious art payloads kept his knuckles white but steady until they coasted into the drop-off lane. Rowan marched through the doors carrying the rolled mural over her shoulder like an explorer's standard. Bristol followed with packets of archival mounting tape. Thayer brought up the rear, one hand supporting the muslin wrap that shielded the charcoal from smudging. In the classroom, the other children presented collages of passport photos, shoebox dioramas of Ellis Island, a papier-mâché Viking longship. Rowan waited until last, then unfurled her mural across the chalkboard so the vines stretched from one wall to the other, eclipsing even the alphabet strip. The class hushed. Rowan tapped the glittering birthmark on the sketch and announced, "This is the star that travels on both sides of my family tree. It means my mom and my dad are constellations that finally found the same sky." The teacher, hard to impress, pressed a hand to her chest and murmured that sometimes artistic statements required no rubric. Bristol caught Thayer's sleeve, nails biting fabric with barely contained pride, and whispered, "She wrote that line herself last night when I thought she was asleep." After the applause, after adhesive tape squeaked under the mural's weight, Rowan tugged Thayer's sleeve and asked whether Florence really smelled like old stone and hot sugar, the way Mom always described. Thayer knelt, heedless of chalk dust creasing his trousers, and promised they would all go the coming summer. They would trace the Arno at dusk, paint the Ponte Vecchio under street lamps, and row beneath stars that looked different yet familiar, proving geography could stretch but not break the thread of their shared mark. Bristol added that before Italy they would need passports in Rowan's dual surname, a father's signature beside the mother's on application forms, and that thought, which once would have frozen Thayer in lawyerly dread, now filled him with an odd serenity. Legalities, he realized, were no longer hurdles. They were mileposts on a road being built plank by plank beneath their feet. Leaving the school, they stopped at the gallery because Rowan swore she'd left her favorite mechanical pencil in the mezzanine. While she clattered upstairs, Bristol asked Thayer whether he'd noticed the unopened DNA kit still tucked behind a stack of shipping tubes. She said the insurance assessor might question paternity paperwork before approving certain rider policies, and that maybe, with calm waters finally ahead, they should finish what they started. Thayer thought of Rowan's mural vines, the unbroken loop of brass gear, and surprised himself by shrugging. If a document helped Rowan someday navigate bureaucracy, he'd swab both cheeks until they stung. But for his own peace, he no longer needed stamped certainty. Bristol appeared to savor this answer. She conceded the kit could wait for an occasion less scented with fresh plaster and new beginnings, then reached for his bandaged hand, skin still pink where the flame had kissed it weeks ago, and placed a kiss on the scar line. The gesture was so unstudied it made him gasp, a quiet inhalation of wonder he thought he'd spent long ago. When Rowan thundered back down, pencil brandished, she also carried the gallery's giant guest book and proposed they sign their names first before the weekend crowds arrived. Bristol teased that owners didn't usually autograph their own establishment, but Rowan had flattened the page and produced a marker. Bristol signed in turquoise paint pen. Thayer wrote beneath her in black ink. Rowan, refusing to be relegated to the bottom, wrote hers across both in looping, monarch-sized letters, then dotted the I in hawthorn with a 5-point star. She closed the cover with a clap and declared the gallery officially open to infinite possibilities. That evening, they dined on the rooftop terrace, heaters glowing, harbor lights scattering coins across the water. Over pumpkin ravioli, Rowan presented a handwritten itinerary titled Places We Will Paint and Eat. First line, Florence gelato for breakfast. Second, the Badlands, because rock layers looked like cake. Third, the ISS, contingent on rocket ride. Availability. Bristol raised a brow at the space station, but Thayer promised to call some aerospace friends and at least schedule a tour of mission control. Rowan, satisfied, leaned her head against his arm, and for minutes neither adult moved, believing if they kept perfectly still time might grant them a longer dusk. Lights from passing ferries traced streaks on the black water. Overhead, one satellite winked against a velvet sky. Thayer followed its trajectory until it vanished, a pinpoint traveling through darkness yet visible because it caught the sun, and he thought how love could act the same. A reflection carrying proof of warmth even when the source lay beyond the horizon. Inside the apartment later, Bristol found the old moleskin from Florence resting on her pillow, open to a fresh page where Thayer had sketched a small planet with 3 tiny stars orbiting it. Beneath he'd written, "Next chapter begins here. Co-authors invited." She pressed the book to her chest, breathed in faint memories of Tuscany mingled with today's graphite, and walked to Rowan's room to tuck her daughter in. Thayer joined them, turning on the glow-paint planets they had hung above her bed. The gear from the burned orrery ticked faintly inside the new motor he'd engineered, a lullaby of measured motion. Rowan murmured that she could hear the universe spinning, then slipped into sleep, lashes fluttering against cheeks. Bristol and Thayer stood shoulder to shoulder watching her, and though no paper yet certified what Rowan had declared true, the rhythm of their combined heartbeats said everything the unbroken seal on a DNA envelope never could.